But for nuclear energy, things were different. The race for nuclear power between the United States, Japan and various European countries was led by France. And it remains the country with the greatest number of nuclear plants per capita today. On March the 6th, 1973, the French nuclear program was launched in a televised speech by President Pompidou's Prime Minister, Pierre Mesmer.
Mais notre grande chance, c'est l'énergie électrique d'origine nucléaire. Parce que nous avons une bonne expérience dans tout cela. Nous l'avons depuis la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale et nous avons développé toutes les activités nucléaires, civiles et militaires depuis une douzaine d'années, comme vous le savez. Et puis aussi parce que maintenant, nous avons la volonté de le faire, car nous croyons que c'est cela la solution à nos besoins. Et nous avons pris aujourd'hui même une décision très importante. Nous avons pris la décision de réaliser en 1974 et 1975 le lancement de 13 centrales nucléaires de 1000 mégawatts chacune, qui coûtent environ 1 milliard de francs actuels chacune.
The speech was seen as a victory for nuclear energy, and its supporters were very influential people at the fore of the French electricity industry. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who succeeded Georges Pompidou as the French president, was the great deviser of this ambitious program. But hardly had it started when people from all over France demonstrated in a show of discontent and anger. The nuclear power plants had been built without the people's consent, and many of them feared the danger they represented. Anti-nuclear activists took to the streets, not just in France, but all over the world, and marked the beginning of today's environmental movement. However, their determination was not enough to stop the nuclear tide, and in the following years France created 19 new plants, sheltering 58 reactors, with a 62,000 megawatt capacity each. The problem of nuclear waste or possible nuclear disaster notwithstanding, the program was an indisputable achievement of technological advancement, allowing France to produce 70% of its own electricity. Five years later, the industry experienced a crisis on an unexpected scale. But the second oil crisis was not triggered by a war. This time it was triggered by a revolution, which was to shake Iran in the 1970s and 1980s. As in the time of Mossadegh, the man behind the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951, the Islamic Revolution against the Shah of Iran started with an oil workers' strike in October 1978. In just a few days, the strike paralyzed Abadan, one of the largest refineries in the world, spread throughout the Iranian oil sector, and inflamed the whole country. Ayatollah Khomeini, the Shah's fiercest opponent, who was in exile in a French village near Paris, solemnly called for resistance, declaring that to join the strike was to obey God's will. His call rang out across the country, and soon not a drop of oil was extracted in Iran, a country that produced 6 million barrels a day. The crisis occurred in the autumn, a season when oil companies traditionally stored stocks of oil as provisions for winter. And as Iran was OPEC's second largest exporter of oil after Saudi Arabia, a shortage was bound to occur. It wasn't immediately felt, though, as OPEC's remaining members tried to fill the gap. And still, prices rose as the market reacted to the hysteria in a somewhat irrational fashion.
It's not just an economic phenomenon, it's also a psychological one. It is a broad proclamation to consumers, to politicians, to producers in the developed world that they are no longer in control of their energy destiny. And this, I think, that psychological impact also has long-term inflationary pressures. It's the inflation built on fear, and you can certainly see that in 1978 and 79 with the Iranian Revolution and the price shock that comes then, the doubling of oil again. Part of that is a psychological response to the memory of 1973, where people are saying, here we go again, we no longer control our own energy source, how can we protect ourselves in the future? And that psychological impact bids up the price of oil dramatically in 1979 and 1980.
The unrest in Iran soon descended into Shia rebellion as the mullahs called the people to action. The Shah, who was ill and physically weakened, couldn't control the situation, especially since his American friends, exasperated by his growing megalomania, had abandoned him. Though he had been raised to the height of his power by oil after Mossadegh's fall, it was oil again that was to cause his ruin. On January the 16th, 1979, he was compelled to leave Iran forever and live out his years in exile. 1 week later, on January the 23rd, Tehran welcomed Ayatollah Khomeini as its new hero. His return from exile marked the beginning of the Iranian Islamic Revolution. The chaos that ensued only worsened the crisis further. Despite Saudi efforts to maintain supply by operating at capacity, a crisis could not be avoided. Between December 1978 and May 1979, the price of a barrel of oil increased by up to 175% in some countries. It was during this time that border disputes occurred between Iran and Iraq, in the region of Shatt al-Arab, a region that was very rich in oil. The Shah and Saddam Hussein had signed a non-aggression pact 5 years earlier in Algiers. It was intended to put an end to secular conflict over the position of the border. But times had changed. After the Shah's fall, Saddam Hussein no longer felt the need to respect the agreement. And he had the full political and economic support of Gulf countries, who were concerned by the rise of Iranian revolutionary Islam and happy to let Iraq do the dirty work. At that time, the West and the USSR also approved of the modern secular regime of Baghdad. They saw Iraq as a possible shield against Shiite Islamism and gave Saddam free rein. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in September 1980. He told his troops it would be a walkover, but it lasted 8 years, with its fair share of atrocities on both sides. Fanatical child soldiers used as human shields, gassed innocent civilians, hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Oil soon became a major strategic stake in the war between these prosperous oil-producing countries. On both sides, oil fields became a major target for land, air and sea attacks. The mass destruction that followed kept oil markets in fear of shortage and speculation increased. The situation continued until the middle of the 1980s, more than 10 years after the first oil crisis. Whilst slowing down the West's economic growth, the crisis had a far greater effect on the Third World, in the countries that didn't produce oil. The increase in their energy bill, which sometimes represented 90% of their imports, had dramatic economic and social consequences and doomed them to stagnation. After the hope of the 1960s, the 1970s opened up a long period of excessive debts, political unsteadiness and mass migration, mainly caused by the oil crisis. But for the OPEC countries, the price explosion had a completely opposite effect. Their economies were flooded by a downpour of petrodollars, a new word coined after the first oil crisis.